If you guys are anything like me, then you will have heard a lot about the First Law and a lot about Joe Abercrombie. So I finally started the First Law, and here is my review of book 1, The Blade itself. Starting spoiler free, but then becoming spoilery. I'm sure lots of you have read this series already, and I thought you would be interested in my spoilery thoughts. If you have read it, do stick around for those spoilery thoughts in the second half of the video. But first, my spoiler-free thoughts. The Blade itself is the debut novel from author Joe Abercrombie, the self-proclaimed Lord Grimdark. It was released in 2006 and is unsurprisingly a grimdark fantasy opening to the First Law trilogy. The trilogy was then expanded into a larger series with 3 standalone novels and a second trilogy, the most recent of which was released in 2021. In The Blade itself, we mainly follow 3 characters: an infamous barbarian, a dashingly selfish nobleman, and a crippled inquisitor cum torturer. This series is all the rage on Booktube, and therefore I have heard lots and lots of people's thoughts on this first book. And everything I had heard about this book could pretty much be summed up as 2 things. So, number 1, the characters are brilliant, and this is something that everyone agrees on. And number 2, it basically has no plot. Okay, all in all, I want to tell you that I agree with about 50% of that assessment. The characters are great. Abercrombie realises them very well, and the viewpoints of each feel very distinct, both in terms of the voice that Abercrombie gives them and even the style of prose that changes depending upon our viewpoint character. Every character has real and understandable motivations regardless of whether you like them or not, and they remain interesting throughout the book. This is what Abercrombie is so commonly praised for, so no surprise I agree. The main character's character work was absolutely excellent. One thing that I wasn't expecting, however, was how much I would love the side characters. I found the characters who either didn't have any viewpoints at all or those with very few viewpoints just as interesting as the main viewpoint characters themselves. And that to me speaks volumes about the author as someone capable of creating interesting and realistic side characters even with very limited page time. This is no mean feat. Every single character has a unique perspective, a unique voice, and a uniquely messed up side to them, no matter how little of them we actually see. Let's briefly move on from the characters and start thinking about the plot that I had been told was non-existent. I have to say that that lack of plot has been greatly exaggerated in my eyes. Now, don't get me wrong, the plot is not a twisty, intricately structured crescendo that explodes into an epic ending that shows the entire book in a completely new light. This ain't no Sanderlanche, okay? However, there is actually a plot, and it's actually a pretty good one. It is, however, quite slow, and most of the character arcs are largely internal. It's not action movies and fireworks, but it is characters progressing and evolving. Really, the characters are the plot, and I think that's a great thing. The book resolved in a satisfying way as the characters had moved and evolved, and I don't think we needed a blockbuster action plot. If you do want that style though, you will find this book slow, so be warned. In terms of world building and lore, info dumps were minimal and we gained appreciation for the world as plot events happened. It never really felt like an event was there purely to fill me, the reader, in on what's going on in the world. They all just incidentally gave me a better insight into the world. And that kind of world building works absolutely perfectly for me. And I love it when it's crafted so precisely with sharp, concise prose to boot. The world itself doesn't seem massively groundbreaking. It has some fantasy staples: barbarian Northmen, a desert empire, and a civilized union of nations. These are all ideas we have seen before, but they are delivered to us in such little parcels of information that they don't ring the derivative alarm bell in my brain, yeah? To be honest, the originality of these concepts is less important to me than their execution. And the perfect example of how this world building works is the difference in character voice between the characters we follow from these different places. They are shaped by their respective culture, and this impacts how they think, act, and speak. So once again, a positive essentially comes back to the character work, which is a recurring theme with this book. Beyond the world building and beyond the prose, I also enjoyed how we saw combat. It was fast paced but not hard to follow. It gave breathing room when we needed it, but it rushed us a little when we needed to feel rushed. It managed to have and maintain stakes, so every moment mattered, and we were always given clear objectives for our protagonists, so we were able to see how it was all progressing. For me, this is combat up there with John Gwyn's combat writing, which is incredible, especially considering how little combat we actually had in this book compared to some of Gwyn's works. Strangely, my biggest surprise was actually how not horrifying this book was. Now, don't get me wrong, the torture scenes are not pleasant to read, and the characters are clearly messed up. But it didn't disgust me in the same way that some things such as the Poppy War say. I feel that future books in the series might make me regret saying this, but it was not as grim or as dark as I had braced myself for it to be. That, however, may just have been me being very, very prepared going in. If you were not expecting it, I'm sure some of those scenes would have been really, really awful to read. All in all, this was a masterclass of a first book. It sets up things well, allowing me to understand the world without forcing it down my throat. I cared for the characters not because they were good, but because they were relatable. They had clear motivations, and the plot had enough going on to keep me reading with little resolution at the end, although the resolution we did have I thought was satisfying enough. Definitely a 5-star read for me, no doubt. If you are going to leave before we jump into spoilers, please tap that like button if you found this video informative or enjoyable to help more people see it. Thank you so much. So that is all for the spoiler free, and now we're going to be moving on to the spoilery. So here is going to be my spoilery commentary on this. If you haven't read it, it's time to go. So go, leave, vamos. So now, for every single person on Booktube who has already read this, here are some of my spoilery thoughts. I'm going to do this by talking through some of the characters and my thoughts about them and their arcs in particular. First up, all I hear about this series is how good Logan and Glocta are, how grey and interesting and masterfully written they are, and I do not in any way disagree. Both those characters have been set up exceedingly well. They are complex yet understandable with clear motivations. However, neither of their stories were my favourite part of the Blade itself. That accolade actually goes to the Jezal storyline, especially the relationship between Colin West, R.D. West and Jezal. Like all the characters we've met so far, Jezal is not a great guy. He is smarmy, he is arrogant, he is elitist and narcissistic. His dislike for the commoner is distasteful and his view of himself is pretty absurd. Yet, the relationship he has with RD and how he slowly realises that it's changing him is written incredibly well. I love that the cultural norms of what beauty is and the cultural expectations of how a woman should behave are booked so thoroughly by her, by RD, and this is partly why she is so irresistible to Jezal. The training he goes through for the contest could have been totally boring, and yet the way Abercrombie uses his physical training as a chance for Jezal to ruminate and ponder gives us an amazing insight into his mind. I love how Abercrombie uses his winning of the contest to feed his own narcissism, even though as readers we know it wasn't even down to his ability really in the end. The way that RD is a complete contrast to how Jezal views other women, and also helps us to see how his assumptions are being challenged and that he really does want a woman of substance in his life, even if he can't see it himself. Colin West is the most relatable character in my eyes throughout the majority of the book, and is the most normal and probably the most good character we actually get to see. And so it made me so viscerally angry when Abercrombie pulls that rug out from under us when he abuses RD. It was a powerful way of waking us up to the fact that a veneer of respectability can hide a lot of things. And whereas Logan, Glocta and Jezal maintain that facade in public, they certainly don't within their own minds when we see their thoughts. As we get their viewpoints, we see their weaknesses and their dark secrets. Colin West, however, has hidden this side of himself even from himself. He has suppressed it just like he has repressed his memories from home, and I'm really interested to see how that develops in the later books. I'm really hoping we engage with the questions of nature versus nurture, whether a man is doomed to become, in some ways, his father. And this is one of those character mysteries that has me wanting to come back for more in this series, and it's a character that seems to be pretty secondary in importance, to be honest, yet it still has really hooked me in. Now don't get me wrong, Logan and Glocta are very interesting. They're very interesting characters, but they seem to get a lot more love from readers, so I really wanted to highlight how much I enjoyed that other story arc with Jezal, RD and Colin, and how that was a really big part of this book for me. Now moving on to the fan favourites, okay? Glocta. Okay, Glocta is very interesting in that in his thoughts he is openly hostile and bitter in a way that is almost seems unrealistic to me. Now I'm not saying it isn't realistic. It's just so foreign to my thinking that it feels super alien, considering the trauma he's endured. That's no way surprising though. His heart is scabbed over, he feels no emotions except hatred anymore. And emotionally, his arc seems small, and yet the small rays of light we see as he reconnects with West, they give me hope. Hope of a Glocta who can once again form relationships with people and see himself as more than his physical torment. I have high hopes for where he can go in the series, and I long for a redemption arc. I am aware, however, that this is Grimdark, and to be honest, I'm not holding up much hope of that. The other reason I love the Glocta viewpoint is the nuanced take on political intrigue. I love political intrigue in my books, and I love Abercrombie's take on it here. We could easily have been following someone through the halls of power, a leader, a politician, but no. We're following a wet works man. We are seeing the grimy underside of politics and getting inside the head of someone mostly seen as a tool by the bigwigs. This idea of Glocta being seen as a tool is beautifully contrasted with the real humanity that we get through his inner monologue. That may sound strange to you, as on the surface his hatred has stripped a lot of recognisable humanity from him, yet the constant awareness of his frailty and how the world is built in such a way that blocks and inconveniences him at every turn returns some of that to us. Glocta's biggest enemy seems to be any staircases in his way, and I can feel the dehumanising effect that this has as Glocta feels himself lesser in so many ways. This act of him feeling dehumanised actually serves to make the human struggles he faces far more relatable to me and impactful as a reader. I cannot help but feel his pain and have empathy for him, even though he's an unyieldingly evil man. That contrast of feelings that Glocta elicits only underlines his complexity as a character. What an interesting character he is, and I rightly understand why so many people are so obsessed with him. Let's move on to Master Ninefingers now, onto Logan. Logan for me was an interesting one. I actually enjoyed his chapters right from the off, although they very much felt like the chapters where I didn't have much context. Everything was just happening without any relevance to the rest of the plot, and in some ways initially it almost seemed like it could have been another time period. It had some of the most intriguing elements of the world building in it. Bayaz and the Magi talking to the spirits, his relationship with the Dogman and the rest of that group left a lot of questions that I was super invested in having answered. It always felt nice to get back to a Ninefingers chapter, as they were refreshingly different from the rest of the plot. And this was particularly so once these scenes had additional context, and they were added by knowledge we gained about the North from those other character viewpoints that we got in the Union. I don't actually think Logan's character has quite as much complexity as Glocta, but I am very interested to discover what's going on, particularly between him and Bethod. I feel like there is a lot more to explore in their relationship and a lot more to discover behind Logan's change of heart. There are definitely a lot of questions still hanging, and we just have enough clues to make it interesting. I really enjoyed seeing him and Pharaoh working together at the end of the book. Pharaoh adds enough of an unknown element to the party going forward that I'm sure the series is going to become much twistier as we proceed. And to be honest, I am totally here for it. Bring on book 2. So, as I said earlier, definitely a 5-star read for me, and I can see this book and hopefully the rest of the series being some of my books of the year, even at this early stage of the year. Let me know your favourite character from the Blade itself down below in the comments. I'm sure there must be a broad spectrum of opinions. And don't forget, hit the like button if you enjoyed this review, and hopefully I'll see you guys again soon.